It's a disgrace. Avoid this one like the Black Plague. A huge step back for the series. Not really a joke game, but it looks, plays, and feels like one. Don't play this game. Wow, that's pretty harsh. I wonder what game they could be talking about. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater took over a generation in a way that's hard to overstate. If you were a little lad in the early 2000s, you had a skateboard and were convinced that you were going pro in a socially acceptable form of ballet appealing mostly to men, with the culprit for that being your PlayStation 1, Neversoft's pure passion, and undocumented overtime. What Pro Skater was and skating is, though, are two different things. Skateboarding is an intricate intertwining of the human body and physics. Hitting a kickflip requires precise aim and timing, a skill that's perfected over iterations. Any of those failed ones having a slim chance to kill you. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater is a game where success of a trick is inherent to your ability, and the chance of failure comes from the context in which you did it. It's pantomime, lacks the namesake specific types of challenge or nuance, and in its first iteration, wasn't very good. People liked it, IGN describing it as having captured the pure grit and radical feel of skateboarding, delivering it in a near perfect form onto the PlayStation with a mastery and sense of programming finesse beyond anyone's imagination. But anyone who's gone back to the original without the improvements of the 1+2 remake, not you, will get there, will tell you that it's hard to enjoy as anything but a time capsule. There's a distinct gap between the interactable, playable space and everything else, creating a kind of stop and start collectathon. And once that was over, it was a score builder where the challenge was knowing what to do, not how to do it. What changed that was Pro Skater 2. Adding manuals allowed you to connect playable spaces together, but only with how well you could maintain the balance of both it and grinding. It was a small system that redefined the game beyond its surface appeal. Once the collectathon was over, there was an intricate combo game, the limits of which were up to the player's own understanding of the game's systems. Even without an explicit goal set by the game, there was a personal satisfaction to mastering the game. You wanted to get better at Pro Skater, and getting a high score was merely a reflection of that mastery. People loved it. Again, so they made another, adding to the combo complexity. And seeing continued success, Activision got so eager for money that by 2005, they'd flooded the market to the point everyone stopped caring. There's more to it than that, but that's a different video for a different 3 years ago. The series began to slow down as sales dried up, and attempted to deviate with some peripheral-oriented games that seemed universally regarded as bad. There was a remake of some of the parts of the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater in 2012, which people also didn't exactly love, but by 2015, enough time had passed from the game's last conventional installment, with Proving Grounds, for people to not only be interested when a new Pro Skater was announced, but genuinely eager and excited. Oh, they were talking about 5. 2015's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 might be one of the most disastrous implosions of a launch of all time. Wanting to be both a return to form and a game that caught up with the times, featuring seemingly familiar gameplay structured around online play, it seems like a game that should have been a sure bet. Despite what might come across as a low bar, it fumbled so hard that it sent the franchise back into dormancy. Most reviewers cited incredibly poor performance, spaces that lacked character, and a lot of reminiscing about the quality of older games. Like a lot of games writing about products that fumble rather than flourish, even though everyone was agreeing it was horrid, there's a distinct lack of specifics in much of the critique. Not because the writers couldn't pin down exactly what it was, but because there wasn't much reason to when "don't play this game" is a much more effective warning for a consumer. What doesn't help is that the game was so heavily plagued with performance issues that it ended up consuming a large amount of the discussion, even though a decent amount of the critiques also cited a lackluster game at its core. However, while dismissing a game as bad is good for consumers, I think throwing away a game like this without a proper dissection of where exactly it went so wrong has had a negative effect on the games inspired by Pro Skater. Many of the games inspired by the franchise stick to what people remember as the highlights, imitating aspects from 2 to 4, while existing with their own unique problems. I'd consider this a shame, since one thing that Tony Hawk's anthology of interest could never move past was the connection to the real world and a real person. Not necessarily limiting its potential, but definitely only allowing it to evolve from one perspective, despite the core being decisively gamey. While definitely not being entirely responsible, I think this game, being what it is, without proper understanding of its flaws, has encouraged people to see Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 through 3 as the correct way of making a game like this. So, In my own hope that somebody will make an Airblade that's good, let's take a deep dive into the specifics of one of the medium's biggest dumpster fires. Part 1. The plot. Tony Hawk has a very strange job that makes it hard for people to relate to him, while also being a person that's living in a world that's already had his social funeral. The melancholy of his daily life is turned to existential crisis as he's talked about in the past tense despite his immediate presence. Also, Tyler the Creator is here. Part 2. Literally everything else. On the surface, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 might seem like any other sequel. Gameplay-wise, it had subtleties of the gameplay loop stripped back, but the core ideas are still there to a fairly faithful degree. Tricks add to a base score, which is then multiplied by the amount of tricks in an unbroken chain. Most maps are even throwbacks to the original games, and there's still the iconography of the sound effect for specials that give you more points than usual. Anyone who's played most of these games, though, will quickly come to a feeling that's almost uncanny. School 3 is a level that's inspired by School 2 from Pro Skater 2, but it almost feels like you're playing in the level's husk rather than its sequel, something which can't be said for the jump from School 1 to 2. The special sound is similar, but it's not quite as you remember it. Mechanically, all the pieces are here, but they don't seem to chain together as smoothly as the previous games did. The original developers of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Neversoft, stopped developing games for the franchise in 2007, after which point the game was outsourced to a smaller studio, Robomodo. While Robomodo consisted of a lot of experienced staff, all of the games produced by them were received poorly, but they also weren't entirely unfamiliar with Tony Hawk. The studio got their start by producing the peripheral Tony Hawk games, and the Pro Skater remake in 2012 that people weren't enamored with. These two games shared some of the same problems, but don't exist with the exact same flaws. Reviewers who were disappointed with the remake mainly cited a lack of content. Mixing together levels from Pro Skater 1 and 2 was a good choice, but with only 7 levels, the trip down memory lane ended quickly, not to mention a lack of a level editor that people were fond of. There were 3 more levels in the DLC, but even still, as a small release that wasn't full price, it was a noticeable exclusion without being too offensive to the wallet. In theory, despite being a fine, perhaps underwhelming release, it could have been great for any future projects. They had a product that was okay, there was some technical jank that needed sorting out, but the majority of the functionality was built in. Smaller problems like the player clipping through the floor when entering a grind, or not gaining any speed on a grind that stopped the player from maintaining a pace, could, and sometimes would, be fixed in Pro Skater 5. What occurred instead, though, was new problems and old problems colliding with each other to make for a mild nightmare. A big focus was online play. In interviews prior to the game's release, the game's director said that the game started with the idea of level building and a social layer. It implies that the game was supposed to be a bit more open in its structure, perhaps as an idea from the developers to utilize skating's theme of freedom, or perhaps as an idea from the publisher to compete against EA's Skate 3, which was both a huge success and the skating game that outcompeted the Tony Hawk franchise. Tony Hawk games were mainly built from the single-player perspective, though. The 2-minute timer checklist for the first 3 games and the isolated micro-challenges of the later games weren't set up to accommodate the idea of multiple players, so a big change to the structure would need to take place. A little frustrating since the old Pro Skater missions worked. There's a reason why games that copied Pro Skater, good or incredibly irredeemably bad, developed by indie devs or developed by Activision to completely oversaturate the market, took the same structure. Dotting a bunch of things around a level and telling the player to go and find them, maybe with a time limit, lets the player explore the level and their toolset at the same time. It's a method of open tutorializing that maintains the idea of freedom and discovery within skateboarding, while also letting the player get familiar with the method of play, and once they were familiar with the open mission structure, could let them go and repeat the cycle to reflect their mastery, or ignore it entirely and just go for high scores. I wouldn't go anywhere near calling it perfect, but it's competent, and what people expect from a Tony Hawk-like at this point. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 instead breaks this convention into more isolated missions, stuff with the complexity of a WarioWare minigame, but set up to be played by multiple people at the same time. Instead of objectives being reasons to go out and explore the level, missions create restrictions for the player to compete against each other, which, even if the servers weren't down, emphasize an aspect of proficiency in play, which by proxy goes on to isolate the mechanical foundation, which is decisively fine. This is going to be the part where I lose a lot of the die-hard pro skater heads, because while the game at a mechanical level is some of the worst the series ever reached, I think it's far from abysmal. The cancel windows on tricks are large enough that you feel a decent sense of risk with some of the flips, while still allowing you to constantly be making your next decision. Grinding gives you a decent bump in speed when you're going slowly to let you get around most levels, and unlike some of the other games that have come out that have been inspired by the series, the systems don't have obvious exploits that trivializes the act of comboing in the first place. You can even set up the exact same scenario in the level editor between 5 and whatever game is your favorite, and have a similar amount of fun so long as the scenario is simple. The systems are fine, especially when you aren't playing them side by side against another game because your job isn't real. The problem is that this is the 5th headline game in a series that had systemic improvements that seem to come and go at random. It kept some improvements that helped to maintain the flow, like wall plants that first appeared in Underground, which is particularly useful where a rail might meet a wall suddenly, but chose to omit even more obvious inclusions like the ability to realign with the ground off of ramps that were introduced in 4, the game prior to Underground. Instead, this game has ground aligning that's contextual. If you're over a ramp, too bad bud, you're committed to whatever arc Tony bestowed upon you. But if you're on flat ground, then you're able to realign with the grind button, even if you're not going for a grind. This might seem like a small problem, and without the context of the previous entries, you probably wouldn't even think this is an issue. It's just that a small change like this can drastically change how the game flows. Without being able to realign off of a ramp, the game defines more of how an obstacle behaves. In games after 4, ramps exist as objects that provide you a lot of height and rails at the same time, which allows the player to consider their potential direction as both vertical and horizontal. In Pro Skater 5, they exist as one or the other, being predetermined based on how the player approached the ramp to begin with. When the player isn't given a choice, the level becomes more defined in its flow, which isn't inherently a problem if the flow pushes you towards more objects that reduce repetition. In Pro Skater 1, Mall has its own defined flow that's guiding you through multiple new funnels with their own quirks, making it fun. Downhill Jam in the same game has a defined flow that only really pushes you to 1 or 2 locations, most of which are absent of choices to make. The problem isn't the type of flow, it's the variety of scenarios within that flow. And the flexibility of something as simple as ground realigning in the later games made it so that players had more agency when it came to creating their own variety, even if the game and its level design didn't encourage it. A reduction in flexibility of the systems is all over the place in 5, perhaps most obviously in the special meter. This is a bar that allows you to do signature tricks. In the old games, they're usually moves that are a little bit longer, so you have to find more spots to use it in, but you also gain it over time as you skate, so you want to find opportunities to use it in the future, or at least that's how it works from 3 and up. In Pro Skater 5, it's a bar that you bank, dropping a combo to gain access to a special much like Pro Skater 2, and then once that combo is over, you can press L1 at any point in time to activate a special mode which is unique to 5, at which point almost all of your tricks are now special, but only for a set period of time. I'd imagine that the idea was to use it at the best point in a line specifically to maximize the use out of it, something that's adjacent to the star meter from Guitar Hero. In reality, you spend the bar at the exact same point every single time, at the start of a line, somewhere in a half-pipe-like setup where you can use all of your time on grabs to maximize the base, and then skate the rest of the combo the same way that you usually would anyway. This is a system that has the intention of breaking the flow, but instead adds to the existing repetition where a lack of creativity is heightened. This is the same problem with the change to the ground realignment, just from a different perspective. And even if wall plants exist in the system, their implementation doesn't provide the same purpose as before. A wall plant in older games acts as a wall jump in other platformers, giving you a boost upwards, giving you time to do a trick, and maybe even plan how you're going to use the space around you. It doesn't give you any systemic flexibility, but it allows you time to mentally map out the area on a subconscious level. It's at this point you're planning choices, even if you can't make choices, and in a game where so much of the fun comes from its pace, providing the player a space to plan subconsciously is incredibly important. In Pro Skater 5, it shoots you out with a lot of horizontal momentum, but almost no vertical momentum, making it act more as a way for the player to blindly U-turn. It's a small change that collapses a cognitive layer of play. It's easy to look at all of this and conclude that, as a result of lacking flexibility in the systems, what 5 is lacking is choice at a mechanical level. This is an identification of a problem, but it still wouldn't solve issues more fundamental to the experience. It positions mechanics as the end-all be-all, where quality is determined by the quantity of systems. This is the kind of logic that has people spending hundreds of dollars on a CPU fan for a screen with their waifu, even though the Ryzen 9 underneath is melting itself. Games, like all games, are about how different aspects of the systems relate to one another, not necessarily how many different systems there are. You don't look at a racing game and think, only left or right, no fog of war, no random map. Other games within the inspiration with a smaller scope manage to make for much more enjoyable experiences. They certainly don't strike the exact same pro skater chord, they're much more simple and less frantic, something to relax with as opposed to a skill to risk life and death for. In spite of that though, they're games that are close enough to Pro Skater that I'd rather play them over Pro Skater 5. There's also plenty of games that increase mechanical complexity for the format with combat. Games like Motor Doom, Hellskate, Rollerdrome, rest in peace Roll 7, and to a lesser extent Wavebreak can still be good, they just aren't necessarily enhanced by the inclusion of combat. And in some cases, I would argue that the combat distracts from the solid skating mechanics, but also everything that isn't Rollerdrome has less than 1,000 reviews, so I need to be nice. Where these games fail and succeed often isn't related to if they're complicated systems, and to a certain extent if they're flexible systems. And even Pro Skater 5 attempts to add to system flexibility with board slams. By pressing triangle in the air, you can accelerate how fast your character returns to the ground from a jump. Providing a degree of choice in the air allows for the player to have more agency on where they land, making lines that might have needed to be set up by the designer in previous games more open to the player. A lot of people think this is a mechanic that is poorly implemented, being attached to the grind button, which at times can have players attempting to land short before they've actually hit the rail where they otherwise would have been fine. I'd argue that outside of the controller mapping, this is just a quirk of the game to learn around that I find quite fun, where the bigger issue is that the ground slam is the realigning mechanic, and on ramps the ground slam wants to act like a way of generating speed. This is why you can't reorient yourself on a ramp. There's a controller overlap, and the game has to pick between one or the other, of which it always picks speed. The poor implementation here is the more glaring problem, but the fact that a lot of people don't like the mechanic, even when it's behaving as intended, reinforces the idea that the game's flaws don't lie in lack of complexity or choice. Games in a lot of cases are defined more by the application of limits that creates a kind of mental beat. And Pro Skater 5 is a mechanically fine game that falls apart thanks to an extremely stale rhythm. The real problem is pacing. It's most present in the missions, or maybe it would be better to call them objectives. After activating it from the menu, you're thrown into a minigame that often railroads what you're specifically supposed to be doing, which could be fine if there was a sense of escalation in complexity or purpose. One mission teaches you something that might be useful in the next to then compound on skills, or one mission acts as an inversion on another. This is basically the entirety of the platformer as a genre, just with levels instead of missions. Not only does this fall apart in that, thanks to being a game designed with online in mind, almost every mission is available from the beginning to not lock players out from one another, even if some of those missions are amalgamations of every skill. It also repeats every mission over every single level. This is why it might be better to call them objectives over missions when considering purpose, even if in practice they function more like missions. If the idea is that these were objectives just to give purpose to the sandbox, that's fine. In a game like Shadowrun and many older first-person shooters, game types can be considered contexts that merely constitute and encourage gameplay, modifying the shape of the sandbox without removing the sand. The fact that every map accommodates Team Slayer isn't exactly an issue, because it's not a mission, it's an objective. The objective is an open idea that players find their own methodology towards, and different types of objectives might steer the mind of the player in particular directions, but shouldn't dictate a correct mode of play, outside of what might be socially written. AKA, remember when you could bottom frag without worrying that your mercy was going to report you for griefing or whatever? Especially if you're making a social experience, this is the ideal situation. Not the social pressure, the open structure. Whether you're shooting people or skating people,
it's a lot cooler than just shooting each other.
A specific objective needs to remain open in its mechanisms towards completion where possible. In Pro Skater 5, the objectives are short, often very specific, and sometimes even add functionality to the game that didn't previously exist, making them not act as part of a sandbox. They're objectives on a to-do list. This was literally the case in older Pro Skaters, but the more open nature, putting every objective in the same environment at the same time, meant that you could always snap from idea to idea. It wasn't riveting, it was just an excuse to do the thing. Mission structure like this fell apart when you entered a level and only had one thing to do, because it removed the flexibility of an open list that bounces from idea to idea, emphasizing the sandbox becoming a chore that had you stuck on the same mental beat. This has been carried over to a lot of Pro Skaters derivatives. It was never a perfect system, which is why I want more Pro Skater-like games to solve some of the structural ideas that have always plagued the series to an extent. 5 doesn't resolve any of the flaws in this, and instead puts them through a megaphone. If the missions aren't vapid attempts at silly fun that don't reflect any idea that the game typically uses that would have made Goat Simulator blush, they're stop-and-start nightmares, and even when they were as simple as high score challenges, the game isn't snappy to restart. This was so bad. I need to go off script to emphasize how much worse they were before any of the patches, and shows how highly considered online play was to have its systems as an integral step as part of the restarting pipeline, even when you're playing alone. It creates a pacing problem to every single goal that the game puts in front of you. When it's not the mission structure itself dragging along the same idea for a minute, it's infrastructure that bogs down its open nature. This is all bad, but let's be honest, not what you're here for. You might occasionally reopen the high score run, but most of the time, you're sticking on Chamber of Reflection on loop for an hour while zoning out exploring the level, only occasionally breaking up your zen to think, I'm the guy that made Flower Boy. Even trying to do this won't let you escape this kind of off feeling though. A million little issues compound in the gameplay, many of which require a huge amount of time in these games to really understand their faults. The ground realignment was the most impactful, but sometimes those issues are more to do with how the actions are presented rather than how they were performed. Take the camera coming off of a quarter pipe, for example. The camera hangs at a sharp downwards angle, like the other games, and once you land, it's slow to return to its usual position, parallel to the floor. While older games have a functionally similar camera, it's much faster to snap between the two positions. In the older game, it's fast enough to have the camera remain invisible to the player. You literally can't see the space that you're about to enter, but the presentation is quick enough that you can create a mental map before you have to engage with the space. In Pro Skater 5, the camera is slow enough to have an impact on how you perceive the world. For about half a second, you're skating effectively blind as the camera catches up to reveal the level that's in front of you. It doesn't literally change the level in front of you, but that brief period where your character is moving without you being able to properly see where the game is going is jarring. These small issues certainly have an impact on your enjoyment, but the game, in theory, could have been designed around it. A great level designer doesn't make incredible systems, they take already existing attributes of the game's systems and molds an experience that elevates its best qualities. There's a distant world where, even through Pro Skater 5's awful missions and death by 1,000 cuts mechanics, people still have a great time because of the levels. I call it a distant world because unfortunately that's not ours. Part of what makes discussing level design in Pro Skater difficult is that it's got a bit of a head-forward design limitation. Due to being a game with a turning radius like a car as opposed to the mostly full control over the X and Y plane like a lot of gamey characters, the player is fairly constrained in what possible direction they'll be able to go in the next second. Levels, more specifically props within the environment, then go on to have a huge amount of influence in where the player can be guided and opportunities afforded to them. If you have a rail that's up high that the player will have to jump from, they only really have 3 potential directions that they can go. A rail with a curve allows the player to quickly turn at the orientation that the rail dictates, but jumping off of that rail with the same 3 angles as before expands where the player could end up. A well-placed wall could act as a U-turn, or a sneaky way for the player to get to a higher area of the level depending on the angle of approach. The inherent limitations of the player are juxtaposed by the options provided by the level, that in some regards work with each other and in others against. The system's resistance is also atypical from many other games. It's not a title where the player overcomes an opposing force, resistance created from an other that's to be eliminated or avoided. The resistance comes from within the player, that always exists. This places a huge emphasis on level design, even if the player might not notice it like a conventional platformer, even though they will absolutely feel it. Many reviewers described the levels with a negative sentiment that I would agree is completely valid. Descriptions like smooth, blocky, and very predictable, or joyless, are apt. The maps feel almost vacant, like they're levels created halfway, with some props placed inside of it without much consideration. Now, as a professional man-child who has to put freelance video editor on their CV because influencer would make me unemployable, I want to make it clear that I'm not calling the developers stupid. The levels feel poorly considered, but I would suspect that the devs were caught between a rock and a hard place. And for as much as some choices might seem like a fool's mate level blunder, I think it's reasonable to assume that their hand was slightly forced. Many levels incorporate elements from older games, specifically 1 and 2, despite their levels not fitting within the newer systems. Why is School 2 the basis for School 3 instead of just taking the school as a theme the way that they did from 1 to 2? Because Tony Hawk as a franchise in 2015, and even at this point in time, was being sold on nostalgia. At the time of its inception, School 2 was a well-designed level that interspersed just enough flat ground with rails and walls to make for an interesting space where combos were maxing out for most players at 10 moves? In the time that's passed, and the games have gotten more complicated, I'd say it's a level that I still love, but with the knowledge of where it came from. The level has a bit of a predictable flow, excellent to go down, even in spite of its limited lines, but doesn't circle back on itself particularly well. Going up spaces in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater has always been a bit of a problem. The player often struggles to gain or maintain speed over long upwards areas, which ends up pulling players into the lowest possible point of the level. This is a problem in some of the games inspired by Pro Skater as well. Street Uni X, for example, has a level with great object placement that has the player always looking towards the next multiple of objectives and making new choices. And while the flow on a second-to-second basis is great, it's on a sloped loop, which can often cause stalling at the bottom, reducing the quality of the flow as players trek back up to the top of the level when their combo stalls at the bottom. Later games would avoid making sloped or valleyed level flow over large areas, instead using elevation off of ramps into rails, making players who are on the ground able to jump up suddenly without losing momentum, helping to keep them moving. This has also been replicated in games like Motor Doom, or if this more gradual level design is to be kept, like with Bomber Cyberpunk, the systems on the character's part are in place to make sure that the player can get themselves around the level. Pro Skater 5 doesn't have systems that are able to easily offset sloped design, so when the systems are more complicated like the later games, but met with the level design of earlier games as a key portion of the title, there's a clash between what the player is capable of and what the level's flow encourages from them. Games after 4 that did implement this large slope concept put the majority of the level at the bottom of the slope, so that if you ended up there, you still had plenty to work with. There are ways to make this type of design work, just often not in the ways that appeal to a specific point of nostalgia. In fairness, there's an electric rail which will give you a set speed whether you're going down or up it that tries to incorporate some kind of reasonable way to get back up to the top to encourage a circular flow, but one out of the way obstacle that doesn't complement the finer elements of the game's combo structure is trying to fix a problem instead of getting rid of a fundamental flaw. The specifics of this problem aren't repeated anywhere else in the game, but the root cause does come back a couple of times. The bunker is a hodgepodge of references to the warehouse from Pro Skater 1 and the hangar from Pro Skater 2, and for it creates a dense cluster of references which are simultaneously claustrophobic and disconnected from one another. The underground, which was added after the initial release, has some references to more from Pro Skater 1, and while I think it's much better than most levels, it holds onto a lot of 5's worst traits, one of which is the frame rate, but we'll get onto that later. If you compare some footage from Thug side by side to footage from Pro Skater 5, you'll likely be taken aback not only by the stark difference in pace, but also the distinct difference in direction on a second-to-second basis. And I don't mean that spiritually, I mean that literally. Underground, along with many of the games post-4 and games inspired by these games, provide the player with a constant set of choices and backups for those choices. Rails will guide you around corners in the more boxy levels, and in levels with a less clearly defined shape are often positioned at an off angle. If you miss the rail that's there, there's always an obstacle to work with, and the distance between one obstacle and the next is carefully considered to make sure that you're always one quick thought away from following a new path, and being able to break that path at any time, often resulting in flowing through the level with new angles. Being on the ground often provides you with the majority of fast decision making, while being up high often provides you with the largest potential of where you might go. It's not unusual for ramps to be set up at the edge of a wall that has a rail near its apex, shooting them out at direct 90-degree angles, so an experienced player is unlikely to ever backtrack or put themselves in a subconscious loop. These sharp angular changes being up high or on curves also provide the player a lot of time to scan where the player will go next. It runs the risk of being jerky, but often the game provides you enough time to scan the environment for what your options are going to be before forcing a decision on you that makes it transcend into feeling snappy. A lot of these spaces having quite clear sight lines that let you identify objects with ease also helps to make that snappy feeling. You're given the option to make a choice extremely quickly, but chances are you're visually able to see at least 2 to 3 decisions ahead. This creates not only a nice and varied flow in possible ways around the level, but also variance in the way that you perceive the space, with being at ground height often asking a lot of quick choice from you, and being up high having less choices to make but a greater flexibility in where you will be and giving you plenty of time to scan the environment. This variety also allows ramps that do back up on themselves to act as a nice change of pace, instead of a constant that makes half-pipes pretty boring, which is pretty ironic for a Tony Hawk title. You're always 1 or 2 choices away from a different perspective on the level and a different route through the space. Now looking at Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, you'll notice that that's mostly absent. It's not that the environments are barren, though that's absolutely true, it's that they don't layer obstacles in a way that creates alternate yet comfortable flow through a level. Rooftops, for example, does suffer from huge vacancies in the environment on its ground floors, and is simultaneously sparse in choice when on a beam. Notice though how it's also built with right angles from your current height, while also not curving those rails. It encourages exactly 4 directions of movement through a fairly large area, with the right angle rails giving less than ideal anticipation for a change in direction, making that snappy feeling return to jerky. That's not to mention the space at the bottom only really has ramps, which gives the player more opportunity to bore themselves, along with predictable exit points through the area. This predictable and jerky flow isn't a constant of every part of every level, but it's present enough to sour the entire experience. While I'm here though, I'd like to point out that the issue isn't a linear flow, though in the case of Underground, it's absolutely a part of it. Games like SSX, the good ones, are built on and around this perpetual forward motion, and games like Ollie Ollie World, rest in peace Roll 7, again, are even more linear while still being excellent games in their own right, specifically because they intersperse a comfortable flow with variation in pace and a type of decision making. In 5 it almost feels like every level is something made within the limitation of a level editor, which might literally be the case, but I don't have proof of that. Whether or not they were isn't fundamentally an issue though. Bungie made levels in Halo 3 from Forge towards the end of its lifespan, and though most of them are awful, the sandbox levels suck. Why are so many in the big team rotation? They still feel bespoke, like someone was really given the time to consider and refine exactly how the level would play and why. And the why is because they hate me personally. In Pro Skater 5, the level's lack of flow makes objects feel dotted around at random, like someone was tasked to make a level that looks like something you remember in Pro Skater, rather than something that plays like the best of Pro Skater. This is where the ground realigning issue comes back into play. Removing that element of choice from the player solidifies the specifics of how the player flows through the level. So even if the player is trying to maximize the fun by creating long hanging periods of verticality to snap into a new direction, they can't. That stale flow, along with long periods where the player is making the same type of decision, is where a map like Underground falls apart. The mountain as a level also suffers from dull flow, much like Downhill from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, but at the very least mixes up these large jumps that let you survey the area, not they ever really need to, since 99% of the time the next object is placed directly in front of you. When reviewers called the levels dull or uninspired, this is what they meant. Levels had predictable and stiff flow, often without mixing up how objects were aligned to encourage breaking up that flow and making your brain view the environment differently. For all of the problems with the systems, that admittedly aren't fantastic, and the missions that were a government-issued fun kit straight out of The Handmaid's Tale, Pro Skater 5 still could have been a decent game if the levels were designed to incorporate less repeated flow and a more circular motion with split points, using elevation to assist players in breaking up their frame of reference and provide them varied in and out points from sections of the level, instead of ramps that have you back up on yourself. It's easy to hear that Pro Skater 5 was terrible and make assumptions about the mechanics not working or being boring, but when you start to take a critical eye to it, you're likely to see that the more pressing issues are the myriad different ways that it fails to integrate its core systems. Still, I think there's a lot that people would have taken issue with, which again returns to nostalgia and expectations of what Pro Skater should be. Presentation is a very subjective point to pick at, and while there were plenty of criticisms of the visuals, a lot of it was that the game looked outdated. Keep in mind that this is running on the same console as Bloodborne, so it's not a completely unfair conclusion to come to. I think the bigger problem is that the game just looks a little bit plain. If you look at the announcement trailer, you might notice that the game looks a little bit different. The response to the initial trailer took so many shots at the visuals that they changed the characters to be slightly poppier, with some light cell shading, and the environments were made slightly brighter. A fundamental change was made to how the characters looked 2 months before the game's release. Press screenshots had already been sent out, and they were outdated days after they'd been posted. While visuals are often critiqued, it's a bit more odd that so much of the criticism was levied at its track listing. While soundtracks are often praised, it's not all that often that they come under fire. The reviews that pointed this out often cited what they consider misunderstood inclusions, like the one Skrillex song that was on the track list. On the one hand, I think this speaks more to what the Tony Hawk games represent culturally. Pro Skater was a key wave in the 2000s sea of pop-punk culture, and putting one of the worst songs that Skrillex has ever been a part of on the track list feels out of place. This observation reflects more on what the franchise was in the mind of the consumer, rather than what the games were in the hand of the player. On the other hand, it sits on top of an uncomfortable feeling while playing the entire game. It all just feels a bit... Alright, I'm gonna throw something out here, and I need you to catch it. It feels a bit Logan Paul. Ultimately, the vibe of a game comes down to taste, but there's definitely something off-putting about it. I mean, Tyler, the Creator, and Lil Wayne are in this game, which is fine since both of them used to skate enough for this inclusion to make sense. What's odd is that none of their tracks are in the game. There's a very corporate feeling here that doesn't exist in the other Pro Skaters. Certain discussions around game media centers on, remember when games were made for real gamers? Whoa! And I've got trepidations about contributing to that when the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was made with Activision peering down Neversoft's neck and eventually flooding the market. But it does feel as though this game exists for less than good faith reasons. Buyers would have felt this double, especially on release. Even today, on the most recent patch, the frame rate tanks in the larger levels, putting any sense of responsiveness through a wood chipper, and the earliest patch that I was able to play was substantially worse. Textures wouldn't load in correctly, there was constant stuttering, the tendrils of a game designed around online play hooked even further into the wait times. For people spending money on the game, obviously this isn't what you'd want, and you're going to be more upset that you've just spent 5 hours of your minimum wage job on a game that hardly ran. In retrospect, however, this paints a very clear picture of what the development for this game was like. Robomodo likely cared a lot about what they were making. If not for the fact that there were industry veterans on board, then for the fact that this was easily the largest project they'd worked on, and they needed to keep the ship afloat that was paying for food. Also, it's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5! It's hard to imagine that the staff at Robomodo weren't aware of the more glaring problems, especially those that were technical. Chances are they weren't given the proper resources to make a project of this scale, specifically time. Back in 2002, Activision signed an agreement with Tony Hawk, giving them the exclusive right to publish games with his name on it. Due to how vague the source we have on this is, and everyone's favourite problem, link rot, a lot of the specifics of this agreement is lost. The only thing that we know is that this was set to expire in 2015. Keep in mind that between 2012, when Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD was released, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5's release, Robomodo had developed 4 other games. They might have only been small mobile games, but Robomodo was a small team. And since those games were all licensed games, they also would have been constrained by rights holders who owned the IP that they were working on. That's a workload that's pretty heavy, so chances are there wasn't a huge amount of time to squeeze in another Pro Skater title before the license expired. There's a lot of conspiracy that surrounds the development, a lot that gets presented as fact. So while I can't confirm that Pro Skater 5 was developed over the course of months as opposed to years, it's a reasonable assumption. Now remember that Robomodo wasn't a huge team, but they were taking on a huge project. A game with this much prestige probably should have been handled by at least 100 people, maybe 70, I don't know. Especially if you wanted to make a leap to online play being a core focus that surrounded the game. Robomodo was a team of roughly 30, most of which were artists, and one of the 3 QA testers was Tony Hawk. Disruptive Games was a support studio that also worked on the title, and has a pretty prestigious set of games under their belt, including Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2. They had 13 people working on the game, with their roles unspecified, which brings the total amount of developers up to 43. This, to me, is a severe understaffing from a pure labour perspective, and if the speculation turns out to be true, chances are the development time was brutal. So absolutely, if you were to call Pro Skater 5 a steaming pile of shit, I'd be right there to tell you that it's nowhere near The Simpsons skateboarding. It's not very good, and in a world where the servers don't exist, it's substantially worse. I probably don't need to remind you, but despite the fact that Skate 3 was made with quite a few social elements in mind, it's still a great game. The servers being shut off just cuts off one element of the content. However, given what we can speculate about the development, I find it hard to believe that even if 5 had focused on the things everyone wanted, that it would have come out as anything more than lackluster. Hell, even if Robomodo had all of the time in the world, a part of me wonders if a new Pro Skater would have been anything but a light disappointment. Cause, let's be honest, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater as a franchise is very good, but we shouldn't be redoing 1 to 3 forever. Underground is endearing, but it's got slop all through its design. This gameplay is rock solid, but this attempt at grounding reality, to me, seems like it's limiting what the game could be. You could take the entirety of Underground systems, put it in an Ultra Kill or Devil May Cry level structure, not by implementing combat, but by having you complete little pockets to unlock the next pocket. Give me a time and a score and let me P-rank if I finish the level within the time limit without dropping the combo, and it wouldn't sell well, let's be honest. But it would be Kino. You'd have 4-hour video essays 10 years after release calling it the best game that you've never played, and you'd be poor forever. But it would at least be pushing these systems forward with a structure that enhances the quality, instead of choices that are so devoid of entertainment that it would cure Justin Roiland's imposter syndrome. This is a game that attempted to evolve in all of the wrong directions, but it shouldn't have been where it ended. I love these games, I really do, and while I wouldn't be against a Pro Skater 6 if it was any good, there's so much design that's untapped. It's absurd to me that nobody has really tried to push the idea forward. So realistically, I don't really want to see another Pro Skater, not because I don't want more of the thing that I already like, but because what Tony Hawk as a game is shouldn't be the limit on what could be a genre's worth of ideas. Pro Skater 5 exists as a very odd piece of media. It's a direct continuation of one of the most beloved franchises of the early 2000s, while also being one of the worst regarded games ever made. Potential isn't a word that describes Pro Skater 5 directly, but when used as a point of reference to see what a game might want to steer away from, it's a game full of lessons, both in what makes it work and what makes it fumble. A game that excels in all that it aims to accomplish, and a game that falls at every hurdle have an equal amount to be learned from after all.